Welcome back, AP Psych. We are on to our second video for social psychology. And in this one, we're going to be focusing on social influences. So, the way in which groups and other people and the presence of others impacts our behavior, and how society's expectations can also impact the way that we behave and interact with those around us as well. So, first off, social influence. This is probably the greatest contribution of social psychology, is the study of those individual attitudes, beliefs, and decisions and actions, and how they are molded by the actions of others. Okay, so that is social influence. Attitudes, beliefs, decisions, and actions that we take or have, and how they're impacted by the actions of other people and being surrounded by other people. So, first up, we have to think about social roles. And we touched on this a little bit last video when we mentioned Zimbardo's prison experiment and how powerful assigning a role to someone was, and how it completely changed their patterns of behavior and even their thought processes. So, social roles are socially defined patterns of behavior that are expected of a person in a given setting or group. Okay? The roles you assume may result from your interests, abilities, and goals. So, things that you would like to do and want to engage in yourself and have different roles in, or they may be imposed on you by your culture, the economy, biological conditions that are beyond your control, right? So, you can choose certain roles and others you're assigned. Right? So, for example, I've chosen a role to be a teacher, right? And the role that I play when teaching is different than the one that I play when I am a son or a brother, right? Those are ones I didn't choose, but I was, biologically kind of assigned to those roles. In any case, social roles describe or prescribe your behavior by making obvious what you should do and how you should do it and when. So we have these expectations of the way you're supposed to act and behave based on the role that you're playing at the time. Think of all the different roles in your life, right? Student, athlete, artist, musician, daughter, son, brother, sister, all babysitter, some type of job you have, all those different roles in your life. Now, what shapes some of the expectations of those roles are things called social norms, right? And we know what these are. These are pretty straightforward. You've all heard of these before, but it's a group's expectation regarding what is appropriate and acceptable for its members' attitudes and behaviors. Okay. So society determines the way that we're supposed to act in certain situations by the norms present in that culture or in the group that you're with. So these can be broad guidelines, like political or religious views, policies, things like that, based upon the country that you're in, or they can get really specific, like, being quiet in a library or following the speed limit on a specific road in a specific state. They can guide conversations, right? They can have you tell you what's acceptable to discuss. They can define a dress code. In most offices, you wear business attire, not t-shirts and shorts. At school, you're supposed to wear, some type of acceptable clothing, which can be written down rules, right? Or they can be unwritten rules built into various situations, such as, when the teacher is sharing information or giving out directions, students are supposed to listen and, not talk simultaneously. Things like that. But those are the social norms of society. Now, within those social roles and expectations, um, people behave inside of those expectations, right? And behavior is contagious, right? It's modeled by one, followed by another, and we follow the behavior of others to conform. Okay, so this next section, we're going to discuss three things: conformity, compliance, and obedience. And they happen and occur in separate instances and for separate reasons. The basic overview being that conformity is caused by being in a group, compliance is requested from someone, and obedience is ordered. Okay. So other behaviors may be the expression of compliance and obedience toward authority. We're going to touch on conformity first, how we measure conformity and understand it as a psychological concept. So conformity is when you adjust your behavior or thinking to coincide with a group standard. This is also called the chameleon effect. You change your colors, you change the way you think and behave based on the group you're with or the standard of that group. This is a classic psychological study to write down and make sure you star this name. Solomon Asch had a famous experiment where he set out to test the levels of conformity. And it was his Asch's line study, right? So his line experiment. And it is essentially, suggestibility is a subtle type of conformity. So adjusting our behavior or thinking towards some group standard. And that's what Ash was setting out to measure, conformity. So what he did was he placed subjects in groups with these pseudo patients or confederates to see if subjects would succumb to the pressure of the other group members to give the wrong answer, right? So it would be you and 8 or 9 confederates, people who were in on it, and they were going to purposely give the wrong answer. They'd ask you, okay, they'd give you a series of lines. They'd say, this standard line here, which line length does it correspond with? Which line length is it equal to? And obviously it's the second one, right? But all 8 or 9 other confederates in your group would say line 3. And that would put a lot of pressure on you. It seems like that maybe they know something you don't. You don't want to stand out. What's happening? Why are they so clearly wrong? Do they know something I don't? And within that study, they found some interesting things. That about 1/3 of trial participants regularly conformed to the unanimous, which is a key part, but erroneous group answer. So about 33% of people would always answer incorrectly, right? With an average of 75% of all participants conforming at least once throughout the experiment. So even if they didn't agree all the time, they at least conformed one time to a clearly wrong answer, which is interesting. Why is that? Why are people conforming in these group settings? There's a few things that influence it. The size of the group. The more people, the more likely you are to conform. Once you get past 3, conformity goes up. The status of the group. If you consider yourself to be a person of lower status, a new person to the group, maybe someone who doesn't understand the group's rules and norms and things like that, you're more likely to conform. If you're looking for acceptance, you're going to conform. The observation of the group. If the decision is made in private and anonymous, people are less likely to conform. So even though you may have been told that your group's answers were unanimous for the wrong one, if they're not present and observing you with those eyes on you, you're less likely to conform. And finally, the big key thing here was unanimity of the group. Conformity was much greater when all in the group agree. When 1 or 2 people start to disagree, conformity drops drastically for the non-confederate in the situation. So unanimity is extremely important also. So some other particular reasons for conformity, and these are 2 key vocab terms that I want you to star. There's something called normative social influence. So you want to avoid rejection or gain social approval. Think about you have a lower status maybe in this perceived group, and you want to get into the group, you want to be a part of it, you want to feel like you're being accepted, right? So we respect the norms of the group. We don't go against them. We conform to what they want us to do so that we can feel like we're gaining approval. That's normative social influence. We want to be a part of the group, right? On the other hand, you have informative social influence. And this would be due to the fact that the group may provide some type of valuable information to you, so you conform with them. This usually occurs when a person is unsure of a situation or lacks a certain knowledge, or the group makes a decision and you think, man, maybe they know something that I don't. Maybe I need to go along with this so I'm not the only one sticking out. Okay. This is especially poignant when concerning tough decisions. We don't want to stand alone in a tough choice. You don't want to be the odd man out, because what if you're wrong? If you're wrong and everybody made the same choice, it's a lot easier to take than being the one that's standing out. So you have normative social influence and informative. Okay, so moving from conformity to compliance. So something is being caused by the group with conformity. In compliance, something is being requested, and you're adjusting one's behavior because of an explicit or implicit request. Right? Explicit meaning a direct request, and implicit meaning an unspoken indirect request. Okay? Indirect request could include asking for or implying something else. This is often used by salespeople and politicians to try to get people to buy what they want them to buy, vote for them, making implicit statements, kind of suggesting or hinting at things that they're asking you to do without directly saying them. Okay, so we have conformity, compliance, and finally obedience. And this is when you are being demanded or directed to do something or commanded by someone in a position of authority. Okay, so this is your change in behavior in response to the command of someone in a position of authority. There's another really important psychological study here. Stanley Milgram designed a study that investigated the effects of authority on obedience. Okay, so highlight this, star this, Stanley Milgram and Milgram's obedience study. And we'll break it down for you here. So this was a shock machine that Milgram and his fellow researchers put together. And in the situation, in the study, there would be an experimenter or someone in a position of authority wearing a white lab coat, posing as an expert. You'd have the teacher, who was the person actually being observed and tested. And in another room, you'd have a student who was really a Confederate, but they would show this person, they would show them, they would show the student being hooked up to a shock machine that they would control. And they told these people that they were testing performance with the comparison to pain or pressure. So this teacher, the person who's being observed and actually tested, would ask the student or the learner questions. And each time the student got a question wrong, which they were trained to answer mostly incorrectly, they would up the voltage of the shock. And the teacher was told, we're measuring their learning ability and their memory with pain or pressure, right? Will it increase or decrease or what have you? But as they went along, the shocks got more intense, more severe. And even if the teacher kind of resisted, the experimenter over here at the lab coat was told to encourage them to continue on and, prod them and say, I'm the expert here. I know what's going on. This is fine. Continue with the experiment. Okay. Now, these people weren't actually being shocked. It was all fake, but it was testing to see how far this person would go. Would they go all the way? Would they make it to this triple X, 435 to 450 volts, which would kill a person, right? Would they go that far? So the results, I don't want to say shock, that's a little, no pun intended there, but the results were surprising, right? The percentage of subjects who obeyed the experimenter all the way to the end was 65% of people administered the final shock, which would essentially kill a person because someone in a position of authority was telling them to do so. Now, Milgram's original purpose for this study was because of post-World War II, the Nuremberg trials, Nazi war criminals. Oftentimes their defense was, well, we were just following orders. Someone in a position of authority was telling us to do it, so we did it, right? And he wanted to test that out and see how accurate and true that would be. And in the end, 65% of people obeyed. So why did they obey? Well, most rationalized their obedience because they felt that the experimenter was ultimately responsible for what happened to the other participant. And in fact, many of them would check and they'd say, what's going to happen here? Am I responsible for what's happening or are you? And when the experimenter said, it's my responsibility, please continue, they went right on ahead and did it. Some other influences on obedience: prestige. The higher prestige of the authority figure, the harder it was to disobey. Right? Prestige, lab coat, white lab coat. I'm a professional. I'm a doctor. I'm an experimenter. I'm a scientist. Just wearing that white lab coat pushed more people to obey. Right? A male authority figure was more obeyed than a female in this instance. The presence of others who disobeyed, if they saw others disobeying or heard others disobeying, they were less likely to go all the way. And personality characteristics in general. If someone is naturally antagonistic and anti-authoritative, they're going to question authority more readily, and they're not going to go all the way. But other people are more conscientious. They're more people pleasers, and they're more likely to obey authority and do what they're told. So that wraps up Milgram's obedience study. That's a really big one. Put a star by that. Write down Stanley Milgram's name. That's a big one. So other social influence key terms and concepts that we need to hit on. Something called social dilemmas, or you may see it as social traps. This is a situation in which selfish behavior that benefits individuals in the short run may spell disaster for an entire group in the long run. So this is considering individual successes versus group successes and things that will help you individually but hurt the group. What do you do in those situations? So one of the classic social dilemmas is something called the prisoner's dilemma. And this is where two people are separated immediately after they're arrested for a serious crime, right? The district attorney believes they're guilty but lacks evidence. So they know These people can either choose to confess or not confess, but we don't have the evidence to pin it on them. So the DA goes into the interrogation room and tells each one of them this in separate areas. If both of you refuse to confess, each one will be convicted of a minor offense and you'll be put in jail for a year. Okay, a year in prison. If both of you confess, I'm going to recommend a 5-year sentence, and that's what you're going to get if both confess. Now, the kicker, if one remains silent and one confesses, the district attorney is going to allow the confessing prisoner to go free, whereas the other will serve the maximum 10-year sentence. So what do you do in this situation? Depends on who you are as a person, right? This is your dilemma. If you keep quiet, you could only get a year. But if you keep quiet and your buddy confesses, you're looking at 10 years, right? If you confess, looking to get that freedom ticket, but so does your partner, you're going for 5 years. So it's a tough decision, right? This is the dilemma that they face. Am I selfish, or do I do what's best for the group? Well, the best outcome would be attained through cooperation. Keep your mouth shut, and both of you get a year, and that's it. Short sentences for both, so you both would have to remain silent. Is that likely to happen? What do you think? Think about that for a second. Human nature tells us probably not, right? Because you're going to try to get what's best for you in that situation, particularly if you are committing crimes and things like that. So we'll do an extra credit assignment in class to see if we can't work our way through one of these social traps and benefit all of us as well. In addition, so there are some things, other behaviors in the presence of others. One of the key terms here would be social facilitation, and this refers to improved performance on a task in the presence of others. Many of you have experienced this before and maybe didn't know it. If you ever participate in sports or extracurricular activities, music, things like that, this usually occurs with either simple or well-learned tasks. So in this situation, practice does make perfect, right? The more you practice your craft, the better you will perform in front of an audience or people who are there to watch you. But it does not apply with difficult or not yet mastered tasks, because you don't feel confident enough to perform in front of other people, and then you become overwhelmed with that anxiety, and it inhibits your performance. Okay? Social facilitation, it helps you when you're performing in the presence of others, as long as it's simple or it's something you've practiced considerably. On the flip side, you have social loafing, and this is the tendency for people in a group to exert less effort than when working individually. If you've ever done a class project with some social loafers, you know what I'm talking about, right? There's always, don't be that person, but there always seems to be that type of person who does the bare minimum to help their group out. So they found this out when they did a tug of war study, and they found that when they placed people in teams in tug of war, they put forth significantly less effort than when it was just one-on-one. They were, relying on their teammates to do more of the heavy lifting than when it was just themselves. They pulled less hard. Why does this happen? Well, when you're in a group, you feel less accountable, and they may view your contribution as dispensable or not important. Like, somebody else is going to take care of that part. I can just kick back and not worry about it. That's social loafing. Don't be that person. Next up, behavior in the presence of others. We have something called deindividuation, or think of it as like a mob mentality. This is where you kind of lose your sense of self-awareness and self-restraint in group situations that foster arousal and anonymity, right? So I want you to think, riots, protests, even, school assemblies. Okay? When you feel like you're an anonymous part of a group and you feel like someone can't identify you, maybe no one can point you out. So again, you feel less accountable for your actions, and you're less responsible for what happens within that group. That's de-individuation. You lose your sense of self. And oftentimes that comes with something, and I want you to write this down, something called diffusion of responsibility. When you're within a group and you're losing your sense of self, you're becoming de-individuated, and a sense of diffusion of responsibility develops. Someone else in the group will take responsibility for this, or no one else in the group will take responsibility because it's a group and we're all anonymous. You see that a lot in riot situations and in protest situations and things like that, where people do things they normally wouldn't if they weren't in that group. Okay, and a couple effects of group interaction to tie us off here. Something called group polarization. This is when a group's prevailing attitudes are being enhanced through discussion. If a group is like-minded, this is when it has to occur, right? Polarization. You're being polarized, pushed to the far ends of what you think. If a group is like-minded, the discussion strengthens its prevailing opinions and attitudes, right? So when you're in a group of people who think the way that you do, and you get discussing your ideas, you only become more enthusiastic and stronger in those beliefs and ideas. It can be beneficial or harmful, depending on the situation. But the bottom line is you usually leave more fired up one way or the other than when you first arrived. Right? Often I always think about political rallies when I think about this, because the people who go to these political rallies tend to share the same beliefs. And so they only further radicalize or polarize themselves in their own ideas. And lastly, we have groupthink, which is different from group polarization. Group polarization, you share the same ideas and you strengthen them through discussion. With groupthink, this is a way of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in decision making overrides the possible alternatives. So you don't all think the same way, but no one wants to rock the boat. They want to have harmony, so they don't say anything. They don't speak up. One doesn't want to make waves. So you go along with the rest of the group's decision, or what you think is the rest of the group's decision, when in reality, it might just be the decision of the most vocal member. We've all been there before, right? Someone is the loudest member of the group, so they get their way, even though other people are looking at each other like, yeah, sure, we'll do that. Is this kind of serious? What's happening here, right? It's like, let's say you're in a class meeting and the class president says, we've been putting a lot of work and thought into this, and we've decided we're just going to have prom in the cafeteria. Doesn't that sound great? And they're the loudest, most vocal, biggest voice in the room. So everyone just kind of goes along with it because they don't want to be the one to raise their hand and disagree. That's groupthink. Not everyone agrees, but no one's willing to step up and say it. Okay. So that wraps up our social influences notes and how society's expectations and the presence of others and groups can impact our behavior and thoughts. Right. We'll move on to antisocial and pro-social topics next as we wrap up our year. Let me know if you have any questions.